thing that was so special about the 90s was the amount of diversity that was present that you could see in the genres of music, the fashion, and the amount of different fads there were. The 90s also brought on the rebirth of the sitcom, including the likes of Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Seinfeld, Friends, and many others.
Now this is a story all about how my life got flipped, turned upside down, and I'd like when this boy meets world, all this energy calling me back where it comes from.
The thing that makes the 90s culture so unique is the changes it went through. The early 90s, clothing, fashion was more colorful, baggy, loose clothing. And once you got more into the mid-90s, it became more of a flannel shirt, ripped jeans, punk rock kind of fashion, where men would also grow their hair out to be long. Then it shifts to the late 90s where fashion shifted more into designer clothing. The 90s was also very diverse musically. They had many different genres, the three biggest ones being rap, pop, and rock. And recorded music sales nearly doubled in the 90s, making it one of the greatest times for music to be coming out. Rock bands included Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Green Day, and many others. Rap artists included Nas, Tupac, Snoop Dogg, Tribe Called Quest, and many others. The most popular songs included Britney Spears' Baby One More Time, Nirvana's Smell Like Teen Spirit, Jay-Z's Hard Knock Life, and Gangsta's Paradise. Going back to the rebirth of the sitcom, it has really had an effect on not only the 90s culture, but also the culture we have today, where we constantly see reruns of sitcoms from the 90s. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is on every single day, as well as Seinfeld and Friends. Along with sitcoms, cartoons really started to become a popular thing amongst children. There was Hey Arnold, Rugrats, The Simpsons, and many other cartoons that people were starting to enjoy. I would say that the fads in the 90s were quite peculiar. There were many fads that didn't fit in the same category. It seemed like fads changed dramatically throughout the 90s. For example, one of the big fads of the 90s was the grunge, which people would wear basically flannels, torn up jeans. Like that was the fad that was going on at the time. Then it shifted into people bleaching their hair more. It became more popular for men and women to start bleaching their hair. Toys and games, very popular toys and games also came from the 90s. Pokemon started, and that became a big fad in the United States, as well as Furby toys and Tamagotchis. The 90s was also a great time for sports, as in 1992 was the year that the Dream Team was assembled for the U.S. men's basketball team, which included Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, one of the NBA's greatest of all time. Another big part of sports was trading cards. Trading cards it was getting towards the end of its popularity. Trading cards were popular for a long time before the 90s, but it was still a big part of the culture for sports fans to trade and collect different athletes' cards from NFL players, MLB players, NBA players, NHL players, players of all sports. In sports, unfortunately, it was also recognized as the steroid era, especially for the MLB and baseball players, where athletes such as Barry Bonds, they really started to abuse steroids to enhance their performances. It wasn't until the end of the 90s where they really started to crack down on the strictness and the guidelines for steroids, because at the time they were quite loose. Earlier I mentioned the importance of television to the 90s culture, but I didn't really go into the movie aspect. The most popular movies at the time were Pulp Fiction, Goodfellas, Forrest Gump. Activities that were pretty prominent throughout the 90s included rollerblading, playing video games on Nintendo, watching movies from Blockbuster instead of Netflix as people do today, and actually going outside and playing at parks, playing sports. The 90s had a pretty big impact on how people communicate today, as mostly teenagers started using AOL to communicate with their friends and peers instead of just actually talking to them, as it was for basically all of history. But the single greatest thing about the 90s was Spice Girls. Love Spice Girls.
Today we will be talking about politics. So why don't you tell us a little bit about George H.W. Bush?
George H.W. Bush was born in Milton, Massachusetts on June 12, 1924. He became a student leader at the Phillips Academy in Andover. He was then enlisted in the armed forces on his 18th birthday, and he became the youngest pilot in the Navy. He flew 58 combat missions during World War II, and he was also awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for bravery in action.
Can you tell us a little bit about the events that led up to Bush's presidency?
Okay, so like his father, Prescott Bush, George became interested in public service and politics. He served 2 terms as representative to Congress from Texas, and he ran unsuccessfully for the Senate twice. He was then appointed to a series of high-level positions: ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in the People's Republic of China, and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. In 1980, Bush then campaigned for the Republican nomination for president. He lost, but was chosen as a running mate by Ronald Reagan. As vice president, Bush had responsibility in several domestic areas, including federal deregulation and anti-drug programs. In 1988, Bush won the Republican nomination for president, and with Senator Dan Quayle of Indiana as his running mate, he defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis in the general election.
So Bush seemed like a qualified candidate. Can you tell us about a challenge or two that he might have faced as president?
In areas of foreign policy, President Bush sent American troops into Panama to overthrow the corrupt regime of General Manuel Noriega. He was threatening the security of the canal and the Americans living there. So for President Bush to take action, he brought Noriega to the United States for trial as a drug trafficker. Bush's greatest test came when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He threatened to move into Saudi Arabia, and vowing to free Kuwait, Bush rallied the United Nations, the U.S. people, and the Congress sent 425,000 American troops. They were then joined by 180,000 troops from allied nations.
Would you say that this is what led to Operation Desert Storm? And if it did, can you elaborate on that?
Yes, it definitely led to Operation Desert Storm. In August 1990, Iraq invaded with the intention of annexing Kuwait because of long-standing conflict between the two nations in which Iraq believed Kuwait was its property. The entire world was against this invasion, and the United States created a coalition of troops from Saudi Arabia and pursued the goal of destroying the Iraqi forces. After their initial ground invasion, the coalition liberated Kuwait and advanced into Iraqi territory. The United States then ceased the fire, and the controversies over enforcing this ceasefire are what caused the 2003 war in Iraq.
Moving on to politics of the 1990s, let's talk a little bit about Bill Clinton.
President Clinton was born on August 19, 1946 in Hope, Arkansas, 3 months after his father died in a traffic accident. He graduated from Georgetown University and in 1968 won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University. He received a law degree from Yale University, and in 1973 he entered politics in Arkansas.
How did he become president? What were some events that led up to it?
Clinton was first elected as Arkansas Attorney General in 1976 and won the governorship in 1978. After losing a bid for a second term, he regained the office 4 years later and served until he defeated incumbent George Bush and third-party candidate Ross Perot in the 1992 presidential race.
What were some challenges that he faced or obstacles that he faced during his presidency?
In 1998, as a result of issues surrounding personal indiscretions with a young woman, White House intern, Clinton was the second U.S. president to be impeached by the House of Representatives. He was tried in the Senate and found not guilty of the charges brought against him. He apologized to the nation for his actions and continued to have unprecedented popular approval ratings for a job as a president.
Can you expand a little bit more on the impeachment, the trial, the scandal, and all of that?
While in office, Bill Clinton engaged in extramarital affairs with Monica Lewinsky, which eventually led to his impeachment in 1998. The following is a video clip where Clinton denies ever having any sexual relations with her.
To the American people, I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people.
Can you tell us some political issues that America was facing during the 1990s?
In the 1990s, one of the major political issues that America had to face was the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. There was a plot devised to blow up the World Trade Center in an effort to curb U.S. support for Israel. Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh parked a truck full of explosives in a parking garage under the World Trade Center with the intention to decimate the support to the bottom of the first World Trade Center, causing it to fall onto and knock over the second. However, the plot was thwarted when the first tower did not fall over. They were later caught and charged with conspiracy and transporting explosives across state lines. Although the explosion only killed 6 people, it injured thousands of adults as well as children who were at the daycare center located inside of the building. This bombing also destroyed the underground side of the World Trade Center.
Was America ever criticized for any events that took place during the 1990s?
Yes, they were criticized actually for the Rwanda genocide. From April to July 1994, members of the Hutu ethnic majority in the East Central African nation of Rwanda murdered as many as 800,000 people, mostly of the Tutsi minority. This event was known as an American political issue because America was criticized for not taking actions while this genocide occurred.
Well, that's it for today for Politics of the 1990s. The 1990s were a memorable and lovable decade, but for many Americans, it's going to be remembered as a decade where America experienced a tremendous growth in the economy. The world entered the 1990s with a bang. There were 2 major developments behind this: the victory of the United States and the coalition forces in the 1990 Persian Gulf War, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. But by July of 1990, despite President Bush's tax hikes, the federal budget deficit increased as the economy contracted and unemployment increased by 1.8 million workers. The recession ended in March of 1991, but the economy was experiencing a jobless recovery where unemployment was stagnant. Yet, this one year during the decade didn't really represent the American economy as a whole. The United States economy grew by an average of 4% per year between 1992 and 1999. An average of 1.7 million jobs a year were added to the American workforce. The unemployment rate dropped from nearly 8% in 1992 to 4%. That is effectively zero at the end of the decade. From 1990 to 1999, the median American household income grew by 10%. Gross domestic product increased from negative 1.8% to 3.14%. In total, over 23.6 million jobs were created in the 1990s, which made the unemployment rate drop to less than 5% in 1997, the lowest unemployment rate since 1973. Although the American economy seemed great, it wasn't perfect. By 1992, 64% of the GDP was going towards federal debt. That meant that America owed $4 trillion in federal debt.
The 90s showcased how even though things aren't looking good for the American government, we will always have the ability to bounce back and show the world that we are the best country, and that we will always have the upper hand against the people who try to oppose us. After winning the Cold War, people were starting to be happy again. But in 91, that changed when an Iraqi rebellion invaded Kuwait, controlling their oil, creating the Gulf War. The leader was Saddam Hussein. He was president of the Iraq for over 2 decades. He is seen as a figurehead of the country's military conflicts with the United States. He was killed on December 30th, 2006. Days after the attack, a UN coalition force addressed Iraqi forces. Eventually, they were able to drive them away and also able to get a signed ceasefire agreement. the terms of which included Iraq dismantling its chemical weapons program. War between the 80s and 90s had posed a problem to Somalis and other international countries that were focused on building peace. Somalis were in catastrophic time period from December to 1991 to March 1992, when the country was torn apart by clan-based warfare. In responding to political chaos and humanitarian disaster in Somalia, the United States and other nations launched peacekeeping operations that creates an environment in which assistance would be delivered to the Somali people. During the Bosnian Civil War, which began shortly after the country declared independence in 1992, Bosnian Serb troops under the command of General Ratko Mladic captured the eastern enclave and UN safe area of a private location, killing about 8,000 Muslim males in the following week. The U.S. launched airstrikes on Bosnia to prevent ethnic cleansing, primarily by Serbs against Bosnians. The U.S. became part of NATO's peacekeeping force in the region. More warfare occurred after that with the attack of Yugoslavia, when young province of Kosovo erupted into violence in the spring of 1999. A U.S.-led NATO force intervened with airstrikes after Serbian forces uprooted the population and embarked on the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo's Albanian population. They enjoyed a measure of cultural freedom while it lasted. If it wasn't for the NATO force, it would have been an even bigger problem for us. Thanks to the strong leadership that the United States had during the 90s and the beginning of the new millennium, President Bill Clinton and future President George W. Bush showed us, the American people, that we can be the most dedicated, determined, and dominant country that everyone knows. With consistency and continuity, they were able to implement a multi-dimensional, realistic policy, the main manifestations of which allowed the U.S. to gain, in a few years, solid political, economic, military, and diplomatic leverages. This was a strong part in why the United States were able to handle all of these foreign policies.
We're here to talk about the societal issues during the 1990s. So, what were some of the societal issues during this time?
Well, America faced a few societal issues during the 1990s, one of them being women's rights. During the 1990s, feminism grew stronger and more powerful. The women of the 90s experienced an exponential increase in their importance. Several women testified in the Supreme Court after they had been sexually harassed by Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. This allowed more and more women to become outspoken about the injustices of the decade. That year also, 1992, was named the Year of the Woman because more and more women were elected into political positions than ever before. It also helped to have someone like First Lady Hillary Clinton.
Why would you say that it was helpful for Hillary Clinton to be president during this time?
Well, Hillary Clinton was a staple for the women's movement of the 1990s. She was one of the authors on the bill against violence on women, and ultimately she was named the single most powerful First Lady ever.
What I represent is generational change. It's not just about me. And I think that the kind of opportunities that women are coming into their own in this country are really so broad and deep that we should all be willing to take responsibility and to do what we can.
Another societal issue would also be Generation X. Basically, I focus on the generation born between the 1960s and the 1980s that lived through the 90s. The characteristics of this culture were touched on the themes of school bullying, school violence, teen drug use, peer pressure, and broken or dysfunctional families set in junior high school environment in New Jersey during the early mid-1990s.